when it comes to your camera setup or the settings that you use when you're shooting video, it's kind of a personal preference. I do get asked often what camera settings I use. And, although there are a million different ways to do it, in today's video, we're going to put camera settings and setup all into context. Although there are a ton of camera options out there, there are a number of things that tend to stay the same or are similar regardless of what camera you're using. And that has to do with settings. So today what I want to do is just give you a good starting point. I'm going to share with you how I have my camera set up and the settings that I use. And by the end of this video, this should give you a good starting point. So I always encourage you to go out and use the settings, use your camera, and then make modifications based on however you use the camera. So I'm not just going to share my settings with you today. I'm also going to give you scenarios in which I use these settings, some of the reasoning behind that setup, and we have a number of topics to go through. So let's get started. So we're going to take a close look at the Sony FX3 paired with the Sigma 24 to 70 millimeter f2.8 lens. This setup is one of my favorite setups. I probably use this about 80% of the time. But when I'm looking for a camera, I do like to have certain dials so that I can set those up, I can customize them, and they work really well with my workflow. So first of all, I like to have a front dial, and you can see that the FX3 has that here. And then if I turn the camera around, there is a dial up top here. And then I also have a wheel right here. We're going to talk about exposure today, and there are three main settings that are going to help you with exposure. One is your aperture, the other is your shutter angle, and then the third is your ISO. And what I do is I customize each of these dials to match up with one of those three settings, because these are the settings that I am changing the most when I am either shooting with a client or shooting here in the studio. This front dial I like to customize for my aperture setting. On the back here, this upper dial I like to have customized for my shutter angle, and then I like to be able to rotate this dial to modify my ISO. In addition to these dials, anytime I am shopping for a camera, I also want to make sure that I can customize based on the way that I want to use the camera. So we are going to dive into menu settings here in the Sony camera specifically, but you can look for these types of customizations in your camera, whatever one you're using as well. To customize these dials in a Sony camera, we're just going to go to the menu, hop on down to Setup. We'll go over to Dial Customize, and we are customizing the dials for video setup in this case. And if I scroll all the way down to the dial wheel option, you can see that the front dial I can set for my aperture. Dial number 2 is this rear dial. That's going to be shutter angle. And then I have ISO set up. So if I do use this scroll wheel on the back of this camera, it's going to adjust my ISO. These are the three settings that you're going to use for exposure. That means that you want to expose your image properly. Now, on the back of the Sony cameras, if you look at the bottom here, there is an exposure monitor. This right now is at 0.0, but what I typically do is the first thing I'm going to adjust is my aperture. In this case, the aperture is f2.8. The lower that aperture, the blurrier your background is going to be, or if you're shooting in low light, you want that number to be lower. And then if you're outdoors and it's very sunny out, then that is probably going to be higher. The next thing I'm going to do is set my shutter angle. Now, my shutter angle is going to be twice of whatever my shutter speed is going to be. In this case, I'm at 23.98 or 24 frames per second. And then you always want to set your shutter angle to double whatever that number is. So in this case, it's 1/48. Now, some cameras do allow you to set your shutter angle at 180 degrees. That means that no matter what your shutter speed is, it's going to automatically adjust and make it double whatever your shutter speed is. But I actually like to have fine-tuned control over my shutter angle because sometimes I cheat. But again, we're just going over the basic rules of exposure today, and so I do recommend in most situations you just use that 180-degree rule. And then finally, with ISO, if I am moving my dial down, you're going to see that My exposure is negative 1.7 on the back of this particular camera. And if I go up, that exposure is going to increase. Right now, I'm probably overexposed at 2 over. With my Sony cameras, I actually prefer to be at about plus 0.7. 0.3 to 0.7 is my ideal exposure for Sony cameras. On my Lumix cameras, I actually like the exposure to be at 0. So whatever camera you're using, experiment and figure out exactly where you want your exposure. That means that I want my exposure to be as close to finalized as possible when I take my SD card out of my camera and I go to do my edit. So in this case, this is the ideal way that I have all of my settings set up, how all of those 3 different settings equal to your ideal exposure. I realize that's a lot. We are going to get into some more real world applications here in a minute. But for example, I'm shooting on an FX3 now. I have my aperture set at f2.8, my ISO's at 500, and my exposure's at plus 0.3. So that's what this image looks like if you are using those settings. Before we get into those real world examples, I want to spend a few moments talking about picture profile. That's the look that you're going to get out of your camera. Now you can shoot in log, or if you're shooting on a Sony camera, if we hop into the menu here and we select the FN button, I'm going to go to picture profile, and this particular camera just has a ton of different picture profiles that are available. Now, the benefit or the disadvantage of using a picture profile, it means that whatever color you're using is going to be baked into your footage. So if I take this file out and I put it onto my computer, the color is already going to be in the image. Now you can shoot in log. This is a flat picture profile. I'm sure you've heard of this before. I'm not going to get into detail about log today, but I do want to mention that I only shoot in log on a couple of different scenarios. And the reason why is because if you shoot in log, you take that file out of your camera, you put it onto your computer, and it looks flat, it looks gray. So you do need to put extra steps and extra work into color grading that footage. Now, you do have complete control over how that footage is going to look, but first of all, I think about time and money. If I'm shooting a video for myself, like for example, for this YouTube channel, right now I have about 3,000 subscribers, and I'm doing a lot of this work for free. Like if I were to charge a client to do this work, I would be charging them more than what I'm making through AdSense and affiliate links at this point in time. So if I make a decision to shoot in log, do I have enough time to add that extra step to do the color grading and the color correction that it takes to get a decent looking video out the door? And when it comes to client projects, the only time I shoot in log is if my client is actually paying for the amount of time it takes for me to color grade that footage. The thing is, picture profiles that come out of cameras are so good now that if a client doesn't have the budget to do color grading, to add the amount of time it takes to do that, well, then I'm just going to shoot in a standard picture profile. So that's going to save me time, and it's also going to save my client money. So this gives me the ability to work with clients with all different types of budgets. And then also for those clients who really want a specific look on their footage, well, I'm only going to shoot in log if, again, they're paying me to do all of that color correction. And with all that said, when it comes to the Sony camera, I use 2 different profiles. The first one I use is PP off. This is just the standard picture profile that comes out of the Sony camera. Any camera that you use, Lumix, if you're using Canon, every manufacturer has a standard picture profile. Now, I just use this. They are all fantastic. They all look great. The only problem you're going to run into is if you're on a video shoot and you have one person using a Canon camera, one person using Sony, etc., then you will run into those color differences in an edit. But for most scenarios, I'm just going to use PP off. The other picture profile that I use is PP11. This is Sony's Cine picture profile. This is going to give you that more cinematic look. So if you're looking for a cinematic look and you don't want to shoot in log, well, hop on over to PP11, which is Cine D. Now, Sony is unique in the way that they have this picture profile already available to you in the camera. But if you remember, there are a ton of different picture profiles in these cameras. You can even create a custom look that's already baked into your footage. So if you want that cinematic look or cinematic style, there are tons of videos on YouTube. You can go look at whatever those settings look like for the specific camera you're using. And then that way you'll have a standard picture profile for more contrast, more talking head stuff like this. And then you'll have more of a cinematic style available to you in case you do want to go that route. Now that the basics are behind us, let's hop into some real world scenarios. Now for talking head setups like this, what I'm going to do is shoot in 24 frames per second. In the Sony camera, in order to make that modification, you're going to go over here to shooting, and then you'll go to movie settings, and we are at 23.98 frames per second or 24 frames per second. So go ahead and change that setting. And then I have the shutter angle customized to this dial on the top of my camera. So now that I have 23.98 frames per second, I'm just going to adjust that shutter angle to 1/48, which is double that frame speed, and then that is all ready to go. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to dial in my iris or my aperture. For talking headshots, I like to have a blurry background, so whatever lens I'm using, I'm just going to dial down my aperture to the lowest setting as possible. This lens is going to give me f2.8, so I'm going to dial that in. And then the next thing I'm going to do is adjust my ISO and just make those fine-tuned settings, and I'm going to get the exposure down to plus 0.3, or in some cases, plus 0.7. However that looks the best to you in your camera monitor, then that's what you'll stick to. If I'm shooting a podcast or if I'm live streaming for a client, then I'm actually going to bump my frame rate up to 30 frames per second. I just found that this works best when I'm syncing multiple cameras, multiple files from multiple cameras in audio for podcast recordings or multiple person interview recordings. And also if I'm live streaming, most of the time, any equipment you use to live stream, it's going to get bumped up to 60 frames per second. So I just use 30 frames per second. Hopping back into the camera, we're going to go to menu. I'm going to go back to moving settings. And I do want to show you this camera is set to 4K. Same settings apply if you're shooting in 1080, 4K, 6K, 8K, whatever it is. The rest of these settings are all going to be similar. So we'll go over to movie settings, and I'm going to select 29.97 in this case. I'm going to adjust my shutter angle to 1/60. If you noticed, once I changed the shutter angle, it did darken my exposure a little bit. So in this case, all I'm going to do is head on over to ISO. I'm going to bump my ISO up to 800 in this case. Now I'm exposed at plus 0.7. That's kind of what I'm going for in these types of shoots. Now, if you're live streaming, you really want to rely on whatever image you're seeing in your camera monitor. So just pay close attention and adjust your ISO accordingly. If I'm shooting B-roll, or if I want to have a cinematic feel, or if I want to be able to slow things down in the edit, then that's when I'm going to shoot in 60 frames per second. Again, we're going to go to the menu, hop on over to movie settings. We're going to change this to 59.94, and now we will change our shutter angle, and in this case we're going to put it at 1/125. So obviously this isn't exactly double of whatever your frame rate is. You can see that things are not exact. So 59.94 frames per second, we're just going to call that 60. You probably saw something similar when I showed you all of the other shutter speeds in here. And then for shutter angle, you just want to get it as close to double as possible. So same thing happened here. As we increase that shutter angle, then our exposure darkens. So I'm just going to bump my ISO up until I get whatever exposure I want. In this case, it's ISO 1600. Let's take a moment to give a little respect to ISO. All right, you're going to hear a term, it's called base ISO. Most cameras have a base ISO. That means that whatever ISO you set that camera at, that is the ideal ISO setting for that camera. It means you're going to get the cleanest image if you have your camera set at that ISO setting. Now, this is getting very, very fine-tuned. If I'm shooting in log, I tend to pay more attention to base ISOs than I do if I'm just using a standard picture profile. Lots of software will allow you to clean an image up while you're editing. So just keep that in mind. With the FX3, it does have two base ISOs. So one is ISO 800 and the other one is actually at ISO 12,800. So if you're shooting in a low light situation, you can bump that ISO up really high. Remember, the higher your ISO, the brighter your image. So you do want to keep all that in mind. Now, I did mention base ISOs to you today because it's just a piece of information that I like to have available to me so that I know when my camera is going to look its best. But it doesn't mean I have to stick to it. So you saw in the examples that I was going, higher than that base ISO or lower, but really get to know whatever camera you're using, get to know like how much you can get away with from moving away from those base ISO settings. But at the end of the day, as long as you're keeping most cameras, under 1,000, even under 2,000, closer to like 800 is probably best. You're going to get a fantastic picture out of these cameras. So I just use it to expose quickly and easily based on the methods I've shown so far. And that's kind of how I give a little respect to ISO. I'm standing here kind of wondering if I covered everything, and I'm pretty sure I have. The thing about settings is it's really easy to go down a rabbit hole, make things as perfect as possible. I just covered the basics of these settings, and the truth is there's a ton more settings available to you in these cameras. But if you get caught in a rabbit hole, it's going to prevent you from doing what it is that you want to do in the first place. If you're creating content for social media or a YouTube channel, well, you want to just create that content and get it out. If you are trying to make money doing this type of work, and if you spend way too much time on your camera settings, then it's going to prevent you from going out and making more money. So these settings that I shared with you today, just treat them as a baseline. And the more you practice and the more you really fine-tune your workflow, well, the easier it is to go out and capture content, take that SD card out of your camera, put it into your computer, edit very quickly, and get that content out. So this is my approach to my camera setup and also my settings. I hope you found it helpful. Thank you, as always, for tuning in, and I'll see you again in the next video.